We talked about the first two propositions, right? That music is essentially sound, right? You can't have music without sound. And then number two, music is organized sound. Now we're going to specify that definition a bit more. So the idea of proposition three is that music, right, and sound needs to be organized by humans, by people. And this comes from an ethnomusicologist, John Blacking, and he says that music is humanly organized sound. Right? And so this is what differentiates, like I was talking about in the previous video, between me just picking up my keys and accidentally dropping them and calling that music versus me making a composition based on shaking and rattling my keys. That's a human decision and a human choice. Part of the reason why we say this is because there are always questions of, well, what about birds, right? Don't birds make sounds? Can't that be music? What about dolphins? What about all these animals that make sounds that we hear as musical? There are actually ethnomusicologists and musicologists who are studying this phenomenon right now. So this definition may change. I think this one is probably the one up for the biggest change, potentially. But as of right now, we consider music to be humanly organized, right? So we hear the beautiful bird songs, but right now we don't generally consider that music because we feel that it needs that human perception and conception, right? And it's only musical, this is important too, when it is then perceived, right, by humans in a musical way. So again, I could be shaking and rattling my keys and maybe I start to create a rhythm and I'm like, yeah, this is some great music. But if somebody in the same room with me hears that and they're like, why are you making all that noise, right? Why are you shaking your keys? They're not perceiving it as music. So perception is an important part of understanding music and what it is and what it is not. And so this brings us into proposition number 4, that music is a product of human intentionality and then perception too. This is called HIP, right? The HIP model. And what it does is that it's trying to make sure that we include various musical practices instead of excluding them and saying, this isn't music, that isn't music. It helps us get into the brain of other people, of other human beings, and say, well, how do these people perceive it to be music or some sort of music-like practice, right? We try and understand from their perspective and their perception instead of only going from our own. And this is part of the reason why we keep music so exclusively locked toward humans and toward people rather than animals and other creatures and beings. We say music needs to be perceived and intended as music by other humans. So going back to 433, I always like to keep going around to this piece because it's so controversial in this way. 433 was written by John Cage as music, and thus it should be perceived as music to the listener. This also brings us into the other example that I posted of the recitation, the prayer recitation. Western listeners identify this to be music because we hear the way the melody, right, and the very vocal like quality of the song, we hear that being performed. So we say, oh, of course that's music. We've heard other things like that. But as I mentioned before, in this particular music community and culture, Muslims actually classify music as profane. So they don't want that to be involved in a religious practice. It doesn't belong in religious practice. So this is where the whole idea of intention and perception matter, because we may perceive it in a particular way, but the people who are performing it are perceiving it in a complete other way. So this is why it's important as we move around and listen to and learn about various musical practices, we remember this. How are the people who are making the music, experiencing the music in their everyday lives, perceiving this? And are they even perceiving it as music in the first place? So this brings us to perhaps the most important point in these propositions, is that the idea of music is inescapably tied to Western cultural assumptions and values, right? What we'll learn is that a lot of the different cultures and communities that we study don't really think of music as music. It's not necessarily serving the same function that it does perhaps in the United States. And so this is what reminds us that we have to check our own biases and specifically our ethnocentric habits and tendencies, right? Our tendency to impose our own cultural values and expectations on other cultural practices and communities and lifeways. We have to keep that in mind and keep that in check so that way we can understand how and why music is meaningful to various populations around the world. So just to recap these 5 main propositions and points about what music is, remember that the basic property of music is sound, right? And sound has different variations to it, different tones, durations, pitches, right? And importantly, that these sounds and silences need to be organized, right? Music is organized sound. It needs to have that intentionality, which brings us to points 3 and 4, right? That music is humanly organized, and that music is perceived by humans. It is intended as music by humans. And we have to remember this point specifically as we were just discussing, because this is what makes a key difference of how people perceive music around the world. And then number 5, we have to make sure we keep our biases, our ethnocentric thinking and tendencies in check, right? We have to make sure that we're not imposing our own thoughts and values on the various musics around the world. All right, so keep this in mind, and I think we'll all be very open-minded ethnomusicologists as we continue to explore. All right, see you soon.